Be nice, all right? Be nice. Just, ow!
Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What actually makes a person impossible to replace? Not impossible to recast. Hollywood recasts everybody eventually. There will be another Bond. There will be another Batman. I mean impossible to replace in the way that actually matters, the way that has nothing to do with a job title at all. And I think Sam Neill, who passed away this week in Sydney at 78, might be one of the clearest examples I can give you of what that really means. I'll be honest with you. I'd been meaning to talk about Sam Neill for a long time. He was on my list. I just didn't expect it to be this week, and I definitely didn't expect the reason to be this one. Here's the strange part. You've almost certainly seen his face more times than you could count. A scientist running from something enormous. A submarine officer. A wizard. A cardinal. A gangster's tormentor. And yet if you asked most people where he was actually from, or what he was really like as a person, you'd probably just get a shrug and something like, seems like a nice guy. Which, honestly, undersells him completely. But that gap isn't really a gap about Sam Neill specifically. It's a gap about all of us. We tend to assume that the people we watch the most are the people we know the best. Most of the time, we're wrong about that. This isn't really a video about movies. Movies are just the surface. Sam Neill happens to be one of the clearest examples I've come across of what's underneath that surface. So let's actually talk about him. Back in 1979, a young actor from New Zealand, barely known outside of Australia at the time, stood across from Judy Davis in a film called My Brilliant Career, a story about a woman who refuses to become the person everyone expects her to be. Neill played the man who loved her and still couldn't quite let her be fully herself. It's a strange thing to point out about somebody's breakout role, but looking back, it's almost a preview of his entire career. He kept getting cast as men who represented convention, tradition, the expected path, and he kept quietly undercutting that from the inside, role after role. Just 2 years later, he did something that still catches people off guard if they only know him as the dinosaur guy. He played the grown-up version of the Antichrist in Omen 3, The Final Conflict, and almost immediately after that, he starred in a film called Possession, a movie so strange and so fully committed that it's become a genuine cult classic decades later. By 1983, British audiences knew him as somebody else entirely, Sidney Riley, the real spy whose life partly inspired the character of James Bond, in a series called Riley, Ace of Spies. That role earned him a Golden Globe nomination and made him, for a while, one of the more recognizable faces on British television. Around that same period, he was reportedly considered as a possible replacement for Roger Moore as James Bond himself, before the role eventually went to Timothy Dalton instead. What's interesting about that isn't really whether it almost happened. It's what it says about how easily people could picture him as almost anybody. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. Sam Neill wasn't actually born in New Zealand at all. He was born in a town called Omagh, in Northern Ireland, back in 1947, and he didn't move to New Zealand until he was 7 years old. He held 3 passports over the course of his life, Irish, British, and New Zealand, and all 3 countries seemed to quietly claim him as their own, even while he thought of himself, first and foremost, as a New Zealander. Even his own sense of identity wasn't as simple or fixed as people assumed. He was harder to pin down than his calm, familiar face might suggest. And somehow, that never made him seem slippery or evasive. If anything, it made him feel more like an actual person, instead of a brand. By 1989, Neill had spent close to 30 years believing that acting mostly meant sitting around in trailers, waiting to be needed. That same year gave the world Dead Calm, a tight, tense thriller filmed around the Great Barrier Reef, co-starring a 21-year-old Nicole Kidman in what would become her breakout role. Kidman was barely out of her teens when the two of them met on that boat set. Years later, she described him simply, he looked out for her, and they stayed friends for the rest of his life. And that's not just a one-off nice compliment. It's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout his entire career, younger, less experienced actors describing the exact same thing about him. Not somebody performing the role of mentor for the cameras. Just somebody who apparently found it natural to make space for other people. A year after that came The Hunt for Red October, where he played Captain Borodin, a Soviet submarine officer whose only real dream, buried underneath all the Cold War tension, is a quiet, simple life in Montana with rabbits and a wife. It's a small, gentle performance tucked inside a massive blockbuster, the kind of role that could easily disappear under all that machinery. It didn't. Then in 1993, director Jane Campion cast him as Alastair Stewart in The Piano, a role that required him to be cold, controlling, even violent, opposite Holly Hunter's silent, unshakable Ada. Neill later admitted the shoot was genuinely lonely for him. Hunter kept her distance off camera on purpose, to protect the emotional truth of her performance, and that isolation from the character bled into his real experience of making the film. What got him through it, by his own account, was Campion herself, a director who made a point of being there for him off camera during the hardest parts of the shoot. Kindness kept showing up around him. Not as some big dramatic headline. Just as a quiet habit that seemed to follow him. That same year, 1993, he was also Dr. Alan Grant, running from something that shouldn't exist, in the film that would end up defining him to most of the world. Steven Spielberg later said Neill was exceptionally easy to collaborate with, and pointed out something almost funny. Alan Grant spends the entire movie visibly irritated by children, which was basically the exact opposite of who Neill actually was in real life, a father who adored his own kids without any complications at all. In a strange way, the role people know him best for is the least like the man who played it. 2 years after Jurassic Park, he made In the Mouth of Madness with director John Carpenter, a film that's since become a horror classic, the kind fans discover decades later and can't quite believe they'd missed the first time around. A few years after that came Event Horizon, where a single line, delivered calmly, almost gently, has outlived the movie itself in the memory of horror fans everywhere. It's a strange kind of legacy, being quietly beloved in a genre that a lot of people assume is beneath a serious actor. Neill never seemed to draw that line himself. A good story was a good story, no matter which shelf of the video store it came from. Then in 2016, 20 years after Event Horizon and almost 40 years after My Brilliant Career, he did something that introduced him to a whole new generation. Director Taika Waititi cast him as Uncle Heck in Hunt for the Wilderpeople, a grieving, barely literate bushman who ends up on the run through the New Zealand wilderness with a troubled foster kid. Waititi later described him as the most relaxed person on the entire set, someone who didn't need any rituals or warm-up routines, who simply knew how to switch the performance on and off like flipping a switch. No demands. No diva energy. Just a man who showed up and did the work. By this point in his career, he'd played the Devil's Son, a Soviet spy, a paleontologist running from monsters, a horror icon twice over, and a bushman raising a kid who wasn't even his. Which brings us back to the actual question we started with. So what actually makes somebody impossible to replace? It isn't fame. It isn't awards. It isn't box office numbers. It's individuality. There's only ever been one version of any of us who has ever lived. That's the real reason people can't truly be replaced, not because they were famous or successful, but because every single human being is an unrepeatable combination of experiences, flaws, humor, talent, kindness, and point of view. Somebody else could absolutely play Dr. Alan Grant again tomorrow. Nobody could ever actually replace the man who played him the first time. Think about it this way. Everybody watching this has lost somebody at some point. And if you sit with that thought for even a moment, you probably already understand this truth better than any script could explain it to you. We spend so much of our lives comparing ourselves to other people, sanding down our own rough edges, trying to become whatever we imagine the world wants us to be. But when somebody's actually gone, it's rarely the polished, perfect version of them that we miss. It's the rough edges, the specific little habits, the quirks and imperfections that made them uniquely themselves. We don't miss perfection. We miss the actual person. Sam Neill seemed to understand exactly who he was. He never really seemed interested in becoming somebody else, on screen or off. He didn't chase reinvention the way a lot of actors do once they hit a certain level of fame. He didn't try to shed the parts of himself that weren't glamorous, The accent that never fully lost its Kiwi edges no matter how many British aristocrats he played, the dry, understated humor that showed up in interviews as often as it showed up in his actual performances, the total lack of interest in playing the Hollywood game the way so many of his peers did. Maybe that's exactly why he stayed so genuine throughout his entire career. And maybe that's why he feels so familiar to so many people, even though most of us never actually knew him personally. We knew the version of him that showed up honestly, again and again, in role after role, and somehow that was enough to make millions of strangers feel like they'd lost somebody they actually knew. Here's another thing that stood out while looking back at his life. He never really stopped working. Right up until his final years, he was still saying yes to new projects, still taking on new roles, still showing up more than 50 years into a career that started almost by accident, back when he thought acting mostly meant sitting around waiting to be needed. There's something almost defiant about that. Not sad. Defiant, in a quiet, understated way that matched exactly who he was his whole life. He didn't slow down because the industry expected him to. He didn't retreat into nostalgia tours or convention appearances, cashing in on one famous role for the rest of his life. He just kept working, kept choosing interesting parts, kept treating the craft the same way he apparently always had, like something worth doing well, not something worth performing loudly. Most actors, once they hit their late 70s, either stop entirely or start coasting on their name alone. He seemed to do neither. He kept showing up the same way he had at 30, at 50, at 70, like the work itself still mattered, not just the idea of being a working actor. Long after this week's headlines fade, people are going to keep discovering him, through Jurassic Park, through The Piano, through Event Horizon, through Hunt for the Wilderpeople, and through dozens of other performances most casual fans haven't even gotten to yet. Some teenager is going to stumble onto In the Mouth of Madness on a late night in 10 years and have no idea who Sam Neill was as a person, and it won't matter. The performance will still work. That's the strange, quiet gift actors leave behind, one that has almost nothing to do with fame in the moment and everything to do with what gets left in the world afterward. Every single time somebody presses play on one of those films, a small piece of who he was continues to exist, doing exactly what it always did, completely unaware of the fact that the man behind it is gone. There's something oddly comforting about that, if you sit with it long enough. The work doesn't know it's a memorial. It just keeps being what it always was. But here's the part actually worth paying attention to about the outpouring of tributes this week. From Nicole Kidman, from Taika Waititi, from Steven Spielberg, from people who worked with him decades ago and clearly never forgot it. Notice what none of them talked about. Nobody brought up box office numbers. Nobody mentioned awards or franchise value or how many films he'd been in over the decades. They talked about how he made them feel on set, decades after the cameras stopped rolling. A young actress he looked out for on a boat in 1989. A first-time director he made feel comfortable on a set in New Zealand almost 30 years later. A filmmaker who called him easy to work with, which sounds like faint praise until you realize how rarely that gets said sincerely about anyone at that level of fame. That's not a coincidence, and it's not just politeness either. Talented people get forgotten all the time. Talent by itself doesn't guarantee anybody a permanent place in someone else's memory. History is absolutely full of enormously gifted people nobody outside a small circle remembers fondly at all. People who were brilliant at their craft and difficult, or distant, or simply forgettable as human beings once the cameras stopped. What people actually remember, in the end, is how you made them feel while you were here, in the room, in the years nobody was filming anything, in the small, unremarkable moments that never make it into any highlight reel or obituary. Sam Neill seemed to understand that instinctively, long before any of the rest of us were even paying attention to what actually lasts. He didn't perform kindness for an audience. He didn't build a brand around being approachable. He just apparently was that way, consistently, across 5 decades and dozens of sets and hundreds of people who worked with him once and never forgot it. That's really why this week feels the way it does, not because a great actor died, but because a genuinely kind person did, and those two facts happen to belong to the same man, which is rarer than it should be. The end of somebody's life never erases or diminishes the life that came before it. So if this has left you smiling even a little, Thinking about somebody you've loved and eventually lost yourself? Good. That's exactly where a story like this one should leave you.